We're again in the Song of Songs, but even more, we're in a section which we're writing. This is our song. We're writing it as He reveals Himself to us, as we experience Him, as we join to Him. We're in fellowship and union, intimate union with Him. We write this song, and in this section is the most wonderful song, part of the song, because in chapter 5, verses 10 through 16, we're speaking or describing who our beloved Christ is to us. And this is the most wonderful thing in our life, is to describe Him. And she's described 9 features of His beauty and glory, and now we're on the 10th feature, which is His mouth. And she's pouring out concerning Him as an answer to 2 questions which she was asked by some bystanders. And their question, well, what is your beloved more than another beloved? They questioned her twice. And this question just shows that they didn't know Him, but she knew Him. We know Him. We love Him. And since this is the 10th feature, it's the last feature. And numbers in the Bible have significance, and the number 10 symbolizes that which is complete and perfect. So her final particular feature that she describes, is a complete and perfect picture of her relationship, of her union, of her becoming like Him, of His glory. So when she does this 10th feature with the number 10, it's like nothing can be added to Him. This 10th item of her description gives him a completion in her description of His beauty and glory, and this is as seen and known by her. I just pray that I would be able to give a complete and perfect view of Him, and not only as a doctrine or like a concordance, just summing up verses, but this would be my relationship of Him to me, and I would just describe it to others. So this final feature, the verse reads, His mouth is most sweet, yea, He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. And we're just going to start with the first part of the verse. His mouth is most sweet. And this is the 10th feature. And when we speak of His mouth, we're speaking of His organ, which is for speaking, for tasting, and for kissing. And this is not the same as we described in verse 13 regarding His lips, but this is something added. So she's added a 10th feature, and this is a revelation and experience that she has of Him, of His beauty and His glory. Yet His mouth becomes the last item. This is what keeps us fresh, His mouth, in fresh union with Him, in fresh fellowship with Him, and His love. And then it becomes not only a list of His beauties, but this becomes a union, and it becomes a fellowship through His mouth. Because His words are not just black and white letters. The description of Him isn't just a black and white, but His mouth brings us to the flowing Spirit with eternal life. And this is like in John 6:63, He says, the words that I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. And these words just make Him so real to her. So His mouth is His communication. And if we just quickly go back through the song up to this section where we're in, and look over every time He's communicated something to her. So the first time was in chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, and this was firstly an answer to her question where, or a prayer, and she says, tell me. So he gives her directions on how to follow him. And then he speaks of her beauty. He sees something so beautiful in her. And then he says he desires to work upon her, to perfect her. And then in the next speaking is in chapter 1, verse 15. He notices and commends her double beauty and her spiritual insight. Then in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, he recognizes that in her there's a growing expression of himself, that as he begins to look at her, he begins to see himself growing in her. Then the fourth time he speaks is in chapter 2, verse 7. This is a charge to those around her, that she would be given time to rest in him. Then in chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, it seems as though she's speaking, but actually when you go to verse 10, it's an echo. She's echoing the words that were given to her by him. Then in chapter 2, verse 15, there's a command there to deal with every little evil that would try to come in and spoil the fellowship, the communion, the intimate union between the bride and the bridegroom. And then again in the seventh time is in chapter 3, verse 5, where it's a repetition of chapter 2, verse 7, where he tells those around her to leave her alone and let her rest in him. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, he describes her eightfold beauty. And then in chapter 4, verses 7 to chapter 5, verse 1, it's a call. He calls her to come away and be with him. Come away with me. He repeats this call to her. And then again he describes many beauties of his beloved bride, of the one he loves, that has satisfied his heart. And then ninthly, in chapter 5, verse 2, it says there was an intimate call of his voice. It doesn't actually give the words, but it does give the words. It says, open to me. This was his voice saying, open to me. And her slow response, or her unresponse, whatever way you would want to consider it, he becomes silent. His voice is stopped. He's not speaking. And this is a real rebuke in our life when we don't have the Lord speaking, or it could be a call to come further. When he doesn't speak, causes us to seek more. So she begins to speak, and this is where we come to the 10 features of his beauty and his glory that she's experienced, and which have been unveiled into her life. And so she comes to his mouth, and the first thing about his mouth is his speech. It's an organ of speech, and it can be even considered speech itself. And his mouth always utters truth. And his mouth utters revelation and connection to his person. When he speaks, there's a revelation. When he speaks, we're connected more in love to him. And this is the most distinct, I would say, and immediate expression of his personality. Something of the breath, the fragrance of his breath comes forth from his words, and it brings forth love, and it brings forth life into our life. It releases what's on his heart, his heart of love, and these words of his mouth just express his love to her and to us. His mouth expresses his love to us. And this is when she recognizes his mouth as most sweet. In 2 John chapter 1, verse 12, the apostle wrote a letter, but he said, I would rather come and speak to you mouth to mouth rather than by this letter. And this is what's happening here. Mouth to mouth speaking with Christ is better than just um, reading the black and white letters, because our heart becomes connected, because out of the abundance of his heart there is the speaking. And we live by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. His mouth is the, you can call it the chief instrument, which brings us comfort, which brings us joy. And it's the expression of his love for us. His mouth intercedes for us. His mouth speaks on our behalf. And his mouth not only is his speaking, which connects us to his love, which is so precious we could probably just stop there, but his mouth denotes tasting. Actually, in the Hebrew, this word mouth is pellet. And this is regarding his taste, or the appreciation of his taste. And his taste is able to distinguish and discern between truth and lie. And so when we come to him, there's a taste about our life. What does your life taste? He knows. As we're in his presence, he can taste either the sweetness of our life as connected to him, or an odor or a distaste. He can taste and he can discern our love and our life before him. Also, this word taste, his taste, denotes experience. When you taste something, you experience. If you just have a bowl of cherries on the table, you don't really know what they're like, but when you taste them, you experience what a cherry is, or whatever kind of food it is. So he has tasted something, and then he, as a mediator, brings what he's tasted into our lives. In Hebrews 2:9 it says, by the grace of God, he's tasted. He uses this word. It's a marvelous verse. Tasted death on our behalf. The eternal Son of God, as a man, he communicated as tasting, as experiencing, as the reality, the heart and the mind of the Father. First he received from the Father, and then he communicated it to us. In Deuteronomy 18:18, when it talks about a prophet coming, it says that this prophet will have words put into his mouth. And this is the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Son of Man, come as the one who has tasted firstly the words of the Father, and he brings them to us. And if you read through the Gospel of John, you can really see the tasting of the Son regarding the Father. And he says, my teaching is not of myself, but it's that which he's heard from the Father. And then he says, I do nothing of myself. The words that he speaks, the actions that he does are all come through the Father. The Father has brought something to him. He tastes it, and then he brings it into our lives. It says, the words that you've given to me, I have given to them. The name you've given to me, I have given to them. The Father is the source, and he's tasted, and he passes all the riches of the Father's love and heart and mind. He communicates it to his lovers. His joy is the joy of fellowship with the Father, but he says he wants his joy to be our joy, that our joy could be made full. So the last feature, the 10th feature of this tenfold description of Christ, is his intimate communication of what he has brought into his lovers, that they can experience him, know him, love him, and match him as the bride. Actually, this word mouth is translated taste in chapter 2, verse 3, when it talks about the bridegroom. It says, his fruit was sweet to my taste. and you could say his fruit was sweet to my mouth. She tasted something. She delighted in fellowship with him, and now she can speak of his mouth because she has known and she's tasted. So she's known by tasting, and the experience of her heart of love is because he's tasted something and given to her. He's manifested his love. Now she's tasted it. So his mouth speaks of his speech, his tasting. Excuse me. And finally, chapter 1, verse 2 says, the kisses of his mouth. When his lips touch our lips, or there's a touch in our life, this gives him a way to speak to us. In chapter 1, verse 2, it says the kisses of his mouth. In this verse, it says his mouth is sweet. So if you put these together, you can say the kisses are the sweets of his mouth, the sweetnesses of his mouth. When he contacts us, or we contact him, when we're connected to him, we realize the kisses of his mouth, the sweetness. In Psalm 119, 103, it says, sweet are your words to my taste. Every promise is a kiss that is brought to us. How about 1 John 1:9? If we confess our sins, he will forgive us. Isn't that a sweet kiss? Romans 8:28 says, all things work together for good to those who love God. Have you been kissed by this verse? I have many times. How about Hebrews 13:5? It says he will never leave us or forsake us. That's a kiss. That's a sweet kiss of his mouth. In Matthew 28:20, lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. Isn't this a wonderful kiss? I'm sure you have many verses that are not only black and white, but have turned into a kiss, either in your suffering, loneliness, hard times, hard environment, or even in good times. He's kissed us. His mouth is most sweet. This phrase that describes his mouth, most sweet, actually, literally, the word sweet, or most sweet, means sweets, or plural. It's a pleasant flavor, and it's pleasant to the taste. It's excessively sweet. It's, like I said, the kisses equal the sweets. It's sweetness itself. You touch his mouth, you touch the communication of his speech, you touch what he communicates into your life, what he's tasted already. It's sweetness itself. And I would just ask, what is the sweet experience in your life today? What is the sweetness that he's bringing into your life? What is sweet with your fellowship with him today? Has your soul found some delight and been touched by his sweetness today? Is he sweetly touching you? His utterance and intimate fellowship is just sweetness. There is a sweet fragrance in his words, and there's sweetness in his promises. There's sweetness in his comfort in our environments as he speaks to us. His encouragement in our weakness. Excuse me, and the unveiling of himself in our union with him, in our time with him in the Word, is very sweet. His mouth is most sweet. You know, in chapter 2, verse 14, it says he admires and desires her voice because it is sweet to him. Now she wonderfully appreciates the many sweets, the plural sweets of his voice, his mouth. So there's two lovers here, each needing one another's sweetness. Has his voice been sweet to you today? Or I could say, has your voice been sweet to him today?